Hi there, my name's Ross, and I would like to thank you for joining me today for this IELTS reading lesson. Now, as you know, the reading test is divided into 3 sections and comprises 40 questions which need to be completed in 60 minutes. Now, both the general reading test and the academic reading test are the same format, although the passages in the 2 reading tests are sourced from different places. The general reading test takes material from everyday magazines, business publications, advertisements, whereas the academic reading test sources material from scientific journals. For this reason, the academic reading test often contains language that is of a highly technical and academic nature. However, in practice, the approach to both of these tests is substantially the same. Now, let us start with talking about a particular section of the IELTS reading test. Now, there are 3 types of questions we find in an IELTS reading exam. They are identification questions, matching questions, and completion questions. Now, of course, there is some variety in the way these questions are presented, and they do become increasingly more difficult in the latter part of the reading test. Now, today we're going to look at a type of matching question that requires us to compare the truth of a sentence by comparing it to the reading passage. And when we do this, we are given 3 possible answers: true, false, or not given. Now, this type of question will often appear in part 1 of the exam, but may also appear later in the test. Regardless of where we encounter these true, false, or not given questions, the approach to answering them is the same. Now, what we call true, false, not given questions can prove a little tricky to answer because we have 3 options instead of simply true or false. And this extra option of not given requires us to look at the text more closely than we might otherwise have done. So today, we're going to look at some of the reasons why true, false, and not given questions can be very difficult. And we're going to look at some of the common mistakes we make and how we can avoid these mistakes. Now, the most important rule, so we call it rule number 1, really is to focus on information inside the text or inside the passage, something which is easier said than done. Now, the problem is that human beings have a habit of jumping to conclusions in everyday life. When we see things, we jump to conclusions, and we often do the same thing in an IELTS reading test. So we need to be very careful that we don't do that. Now, it's natural for readers to imagine something in the passage that isn't actually there. So let's have a look at how this actually works. Okay. So let's consider the following statement. From January to June every year, the rainfall in the south of Thailand is likely to exceed 250 millimeters per month. And as a result of this weather pattern, many farmers lose their crops and suffer financial hardship. So that's our passage. And then we have our sample sentence 1, which says, excessive rainfall in the south of Thailand is the greatest problem that Thai farmers face every year. Now, when we do a comparative analysis between the text and the sentence, which we can see below, we can compare phrases to see if they are in fact the same. Now, 250 millimeters per month, okay, and in the sentence we have excessive rainfall. 250 millimeters per month is a great deal of rain. So they're very similar. Then we have the south of Thailand, which is in the text, and the south of Thailand, which is in the sentence. So we are talking about the same place. Then in the passage, we have that the farmers lose their crops and suffer financial hardship. Whereas in the sentence, we have it's the greatest problem that Thai farmers face every year. Now, the question is losing crops and suffering financial hardship the greatest problem for Thai farmers? Well, logically, probably the answer is yes. It would be a very, very serious problem. However, we cannot be certain that it's the greatest problem because it doesn't say so in the text. And there may, in fact, be other problems they are facing, which could be economic. So if we say it's their greatest problem, then we're really jumping to a very obvious conclusion, which may be true, however, is not in the text. So in this case, the answer is not given. Now, let's consider another example. Now, we have a slightly different sentence here. It says, as a result of excessive rainfall for 6 months, many Thai farmers in southern Thailand go bankrupt. Now here in the text, it said that they suffer financial hardship. In our sentence, we have go bankrupt. So now we ask ourselves a few fairly simple questions. Now, are they the same thing? Well, clearly no. In many cases, financial hardship may lead to bankruptcy, but not always. And we must resist the temptation to jump to a conclusion, and we need to focus on what is within the text. So once again, in a case like this, the answer is not given. So our second rule in our comparative analysis is when we compare words and phrases, we really must focus on the literal meaning of the text as much as possible. A very narrow reading of the words. Okay. So now let's look at another example. In the past 20 years, the number of trees that have been cut down in New South Wales has increased by more than 200%. And the subsequent reduction in koala numbers in regional areas is viewed as a direct result of this activity. Okay. Now, our statement is a little different here. Here we have the writer is concerned about the shrinkage in the koala population. So we need to think about the word shrinkage in numbers or the phrase. What does it mean? And what does is concerned mean? And of course, what about a subsequent reduction. Now, the writer hasn't used the word concern in the passage or any synonym of concern. There is no mention of worry or trouble or anything like that. So if we look for a word or phrase synonymous with concern in the passage, we will be unable to do so because it simply isn't there. So does that mean the answer is not given? No, it doesn't. Because in a case like this, we are looking at what the writer thinks or what the writer is concerned about. Now, the fact that the writer has made a statement about the reduction in koala numbers is evidence in itself of concern. The mere fact that he has made this statement would indicate it is a worry. So the correct answer is true. Now, we need to remember in a question about the writer's state of mind, we often need to go beyond the text to think about why the writer has made a statement. So we need to go a little bit further than the previous example. A literal analysis of the words will not give us the answer we're looking for. It's a different kind of question. Okay. Right. Now let's look at another example. So once again, it's a similar passage. As you can see, in the past 20 years, the number of trees that have been cut down in New South Wales has increased by more than 200%. The subsequent reduction in koala numbers in regional areas is viewed as a direct result of this activity. Now, the statement here is slightly different. Once again, it says the writer is more concerned about the reduction in koala numbers than the deforestation problem in New South Wales. Now, we need to know what deforestation is. We can imagine by looking at the word. If we don't know, we've got the word forest as the main word. And when we think about forest, we know forest is where there are trees, and deforest we can imagine as to remove trees. So even if we are unfamiliar with the word deforestation, we can work out the meaning of the word simply by looking at the word itself. Now, in our analysis, we're going to ask the question. The writer talks about both the deforestation problem and the reduction in koala numbers in the passage. They are linked. They are interdependent. However, there is nothing in the passage that would cause us to think the writer's more worried about the shrinkage in koala numbers than deforestation. No. Although, logically, the cutting down of trees leads to a reduction in koala numbers, it's not clear in the passage if one issue is more important than the other to the writer. So we must not jump to the conclusion that the reduction in koala numbers is more important without some further evidence in the passage. And in this case, there is no further evidence. So the answer is not given. Okay. Now let's look at another example. In 1993, a team of British scientists sailed on a research ship from Southampton, UK, to the Galapagos Islands for the purpose of research into the impact of climate change on the island's habitat. Now we have some key words there. We've got the purpose of research, impact of climate change, and the island's habitat. Now, let's look at some sample statements to decide if they are true, false, or not given. The first one, it says, climate change has had a significant impact on the habitat of the Galapagos Islands. Now, if we look at that sentence and we look at our grammatical analysis below, then we understand has had is talking about a time from the past to the present, until now. Whereas in the passage, it says in 1993, which is a passive time in the past. So we are talking about two different times. When we're talking about two different times, we cannot say that it's true or false. So the answer is not given. And in this example, we are looking at the verb forms to give us a clue about how to answer this question. Now, the second example, we have British scientists are very concerned about climate change. Now, this is probably true. However, we are looking at the passage. We are not thinking about what's probably true. Now, are very concerned is in the simple present, which is now. And once again, if we return to the passage, it says in 1993, which is in the simple past. So again, it's two different time expressions. So the answer is not given. We cannot correlate these two times. Now, if we look at the third example, it says, since 1993, British scientists have spent a lot of time researching climate change around the world. Now, we have since 1993. Once again, this time expression is present perfect. It's from 1993 to now. Okay, so that's a period of time. It's nearly 30 years. Whereas, once again, in the passage, it simply refers to in 1993. So that's a time in the past. So again, we have no match, and the answer is not given. So again, it may be true. We don't know. Quite possibly could be true, but looking just at the passage, we are going to say it's not given. If we look at the fourth example, we have the British scientists who went to the Galapagos Islands in 1993 were experts in climate change. Now, in this case, we have a sentence which talks about the time in 1993. So we have a match in time. We are talking about the same time. However, when we look at the passage, there is nothing in the passage that states the scientists were experts in climate change. Most probably they were. However, it doesn't say so in the passage. So once again, the answer is not given. It may be factually true, it may even be logically true, but in this case, it's simply not given. So when we compare the meaning of a sentence with the passage, we really need to look at all the available clues. So it's not simply just looking at the words and phrases, but the time expressions and the verb tenses to help us find the correct answer. Okay. Now let's look at another example. Now, in one experiment that took place during the peak of a recent economic recession, graduating college seniors were asked to reflect on job prospects. The students were instructed to imagine their career either as if you were a distant observer or before your own eyes as if you were right there. Okay. Now, our sentence here that we need to compare says, students participating in the job prospects experiment could choose one of two perspectives to take. Now, choose is the key word in this sentence. This is what we are looking for in the passage. Now, when we look at the words either and or, they would clearly indicate that students had a choice about which perspective to take when reflecting on job prospects. Now, although there's no synonym for the word choice or choose in the passage, no mention of any word that means choose or choice. But we can still conclude by looking at the words either or and understanding the ordinary meaning of those words that there was, in fact, a choice. So in a case like this, if these two sentences were the entirety of the passage, then the answer would be true. However, in this passage, there's a third sentence which we must take into consideration. Okay. So now we look at the entire passage a little bit differently. It says, in one experiment that took place during the peak of a recent economic recession, graduating college seniors were asked to reflect on job prospects. Students were instructed to imagine their career either as if you were a distant observer or before your own eyes as if you were right there. And then we have a final sentence. Participants in the group assigned to the distant observer role displayed more wisdom-related reasoning than did participants in the control group. So in this third sentence, the writer has used the word assigned to describe the process of student selection in this experiment. Now, if we know the meaning of assigned, it basically means to allocate a task to someone without a choice. It's to tell them this is what you're going to do. That's what assigned means. So in this case, with the addition of the third sentence, the correct answer is false. We have a direct contradiction between choice and assigned. Now, this example, I give you this example to show you how difficult some IELTS questions can be, deliberately so. They would like you to be confused. So in an example like this, we really have two sentences that are contradictory, which presents us with a problem of which answer is correct. Now, because the word assigned is stated, it's given to us explicitly, or really, and we know what assigned means, then the final sentence really gives us the definitive answer to the question. Because in the either or example, we had to use more of our imagination or our inference of what either or means logically. So we really must remember in these cases to read the entirety of the passage closely in order to find the correct answer. Because there will be contradictions in the passage that will leave us with two possible answers. What we are looking for is the clearest and most explicit language to give us the answer. All right. Now, let's look at another example, slightly different. Now, in another study, couples in long-term romantic relationships were instructed to visualize an unresolved relationship conflict, either through the eyes of an outsider or from their own perspective. Participants then discussed an incident with their partner for 10 minutes, after which they wrote down their thoughts about it. Now, couples in the other's eyes condition were significantly more likely to rely on wise reasoning, recognizing others' perspectives, and searching for a compromise, compared to the couples in the egocentric group. That's quite a long passage there. Now, if we look at the statement, it says, in the couples experiments, the length of the couples relationships had an impact on the results. So we need to say what is said about the length of couples relationships in the passage. So when we read, we can see that the subjects of this experiment were couples in long-term romantic relationships. There is no mention of how long those relationships were. There is no mention about the length of the couple's relationships in the passage. And as all of the subjects were in long-term relationships, it was impossible to compare the length of relationships of those couples. So in this case, the correct answer is not given. Okay, let's consider finally, in summing up, what are the key points that we wish to remember in these true, false, and not given questions? So we must start, very importantly, to focus on information within the text. It's very important. We do not want to look outside of the text, even if it seems a natural thing to do, and even if we do so unconsciously, which is very, very common. Which leads me to the second point of not jumping to conclusions about things. Financial hardship does not necessarily mean going bankrupt. Losing crops is not necessarily the greatest ever problem. It might be, but we mustn't jump to conclusions. So a statement may be factually true, logically true, but it's not supported by the passage This is where we often fall down and make mistakes. The fourth point is a little bit more simple. Where we find a direct contradiction between the passage and a statement, the answer needs to be false. For example, the word assigned directly contradicts the word choice. They have opposite meanings. So in this case, where we find a direct contradiction, we can safely say the answer is false. Now, the fifth point is we need to look at the entirety of the passage before selecting an answer. Sometimes we will find a sentence which seems to give us the answer, and then as we continue to read, we later find information that differs from our original or earlier sentence. So we must read the entirety of the passage before we decide upon our answer. And if sentences do have some contradiction, we are looking for the most explicit and clear answer that is given in the passage. Finally, the last point is when we talk about writers' opinions, which is a very common question in IELTS. Now, when we are looking at the writer's opinion about something, we often need to go beyond the text and simply to imagine or think about why the writer has made that statement. In cases like this, we do need to use some logic, and we do need to go beyond the passage to find the correct answer. But there will be clues in the passage. There will be words and sentences that give us a sense of what the writer is trying to say. So I hope all of this information is useful to you, and the next time you encounter some true, false, or not given questions in an IELTS reading test, you feel more confident that you're able to answer those questions, and you have a strategy or a series of steps that you can take that will assist you in finding the best answer possible. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attendance today, and I wish you all the best.